In February 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. What happened during the following days and weeks made many people to think that this war reminded of Winter War, another war started by Russians. The war that was started in November 1939 and ended in March 1940. The heroic defenders who were able to stop the Russian invasion and surprised both the world and the Russians by their ability to fight against the superior numbers of the enemy. In this presentation, I go through factors one needs to consider before thinking that can we compare Winter War and the Russian-Ukrainian war that is being fought right now? Are they similar or are they different? In what ways they can be compared? First of all, we have to consider some very obvious similarities. Both wars were started by the Russians, and in these wars, Russia is trying to conquer a smaller neighboring country, a country that has before been part of the Russian Empire. This is one of the most obvious similarities. Secondly, we must realize that in both wars, Russia was led by a dictator. One man has power to decide over the war and peace. And when it comes to the opposing countries, both Ukraine and Finland, even though neither Finland in 1939 or Ukraine in 2022 were perfect models for this, but they were democracies. Their leaders were elected. So, similarity is that now again a dictatorship attacks a democracy. Third similarity is the national response. When Russians attacked Finland and then when they attacked Ukraine, it didn't lead into collapse of those nations, but a sense of unity was soon reached, a sense of purpose. People understood that they are now defending the very existence of their independent nations and culture. Basically, it is about the survival of the very nation. On the other hand, on the Russian side, people were blinded by propaganda. Probably, very likely, most of the Russians don't believe and didn't believe that they were being told the truth, but they chose to play according to that. Well, of course, opposing Putin or opposing Stalin had obvious and has obvious consequences, but still, they are led by propaganda. Ukrainians and Finns became very unified nations, well, for at least for the time being. Fourth, when it comes to international battle for hearts and minds of the audience, it is obvious that in both cases Russia lost. Sympathy is on the defender's side. It was like that during the Winter War, and it was like that during the Russian-Ukrainian War, and it is still. But there is one difference. While in 1939 colonial powers were still strong and the Third World was largely irrelevant when it comes to the international politics and situations, now the world is much more diverse, and actually Russia has both sympathy and support from the countries outside of the Western axis, in the Third World, in the Middle East, and so forth. So this is not exactly so strong similarity, because also Russia now has supporters. Every war has a reason, and if the reason is not good enough, one is invented. The casus belli, the reason for war, the cause of war. When it comes to these wars, They were lies, lies and bloody lies. When we look at the Winter War, Russians claim that they are actually doing intervention when it comes to second impending Finnish civil war. They are protecting the working class people there, and actually it's sort of like what we would now say a humanitarian operation. And then there was this Mainila incident where the Russians claimed that Finnish artillery had struck Red Army position, killing some soldiers. Well, nothing happened there. No one died. There is absolutely zero proof of this. And whatever happened, it was not making of Finns. And when we look at Ukraine, well, Russians say that there is a civil war in Ukraine. They are protecting the ethnic Russians against the genocide in eastern Ukraine. They are claiming that Ukrainian military is prepared to launch an attack on eastern Ukraine, Russian-occupied parts of it, and they have to start this special military operation. Russians don't even call it a war. It's a special military operation. Well, because starting a war is a crime according to Russian laws. So, when it comes to reasons given for this war, Moscow lied in 1939 like it lied in 2022.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие друзья, сегодня вновь считаю необходимым вернуться к трагическим событиям, происходящим на Донбассе.
Both wars showed that the Russian army was stronger on paper than in reality. In the black and white photograph, you see Russian column having been destroyed in Rada Road in northern Finland. Russians were trying to cut through Finland and cut Finland into two pieces and then trying to conquer it. It failed. Similarly, Russians just drove in Ukraine, got stopped, and much of the forces were exterminated there. Very daring airborne operation to take over the Hostomel airport near Kiev, and they failed. Both times Russians were trying to reach their political and military goals very fast, trying to win the war very fast, but they were surprised by the resistance and the skill of their enemy, and they had overestimated their own fighting capabilities. This led into disasters both in the Winter War and in Ukraine when it comes to the Russian military. In both wars, Russia didn't care about the cannon fodder. The Soviet Union actually used Ukrainians against Finland in this Battle of Rada Road. It was actually Ukrainian division that was destroyed there. And when it comes to this recent war, we can see this map that is from the January 2023 about the confirmed death rate when it comes to military-aged men in different regions. And we can see that Russians are dying in very, very different numbers in different regions. At this point, St. Petersburg and Moscow, the two most important cities, the mortality rate is a tiny fraction of the worst areas. This map partially reflects the fact that non-ethnic Russians are being killed in huge numbers, causing demographical shift in many areas, but this has more to do with the poverty. Poor people in areas where the natural resources are not so rich have very little options to have decent lives, and the military career provides them with one. So we see that non-ethnic Russians are dying in huge numbers for the Russian war, and on the other hand, poor people from every region of Russia are dying. One of the things that are not exactly very similar is the background of the war. When we look at the Winter War, Finland and Soviet Union had made non-aggression pact in 1932, and while the relations were far from cordial, they were like decent, one would say. Russia started to propose Finland demands that were impossible to accept, but this started really in 1939 after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germany had made, where they had divided Eastern Europe between Berlin and Moscow. Germans agreed with the Russians that Finland would be part of the Soviet sphere of interests, so Stalin had free hands when dealing with Finland. But when it comes to war in Ukraine, the fact that many people outside of Ukraine forget is that the war had lasted around 8 years when Russians escalated in February 2022. Russians had occupied Crimean Peninsula and the eastern Ukraine, where these so-called republics were established, they were de facto Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. And these battles that continued, actually there were basically daily fights between the Russian and Russian-supported forces and the Ukrainian armed forces from 2015 to early 2022. So Winter War was really the start of the war when the Russians attacked Finland in November 1939, but when Russians attacked Ukraine in February 2022, it was an escalation of a long conflict where the Russians wanted to conquer Ukraine. When Russian troops entered Ukraine in February 2022, reports started to emerge almost immediately. Russian troops were killing, murdering, raping, plundering, looting, and so forth. It was not about frustrated soldiers venting their anger out, but it soon became obvious that war crimes are actually just one tool in their toolbox, one of the ways they are fighting the war. While this was obvious when you look at what had happened in Caucasus, Chechnya, for example, before, or what the Russians had been doing in the Russian-occupied Donbass. War crimes were systematical and the rules of war were not respected. Comparing to this, actually, the Winter War was quite clean, so to speak, if you can ever call any war clean. Both sides fought more or less according to the rules of war. Of course, we have to remember that some of the rules that exist now didn't exist during the Second World War, but for war it was mostly limited to the civil soldiers. Civilians suffered relatively little. Only late on the war, Russians would really hit the towns with their air attacks. This is a difference. Russians in 1939-1940 mostly fought according to the customs and laws of the war, while in Ukraine the war crimes were systematically used and basically one of the ways Russians fight the war. But we have to remember one thing before we go ahead. When I told that the Russians fought mostly according to the laws of war during the Winter War, one has to remember one thing. What would have happened if the Russians had won? And this is actually quite horrible. When we look at the Baltic states that the Russians took without military forces, large-scale deportation of people and many people were killed. Second World War was started when Germany attacked Poland, and it was followed by the Russians who attacked Poland from the east. After the war, Nazis and Russians divided Poland between themselves, and Russians gathered more than 20,000 Polish people. They were military officers, teachers, doctors, university lecturers, administrators, writers, musicians, and so forth, and they murdered them in the forest of Katyn, what is now at the border area of Belarus and Russia. They exterminated more than 20,000 people, and this would have happened in Finland too. If Russians had taken over Finland, the war may have been like a clean war, but what would have happened after that was that there would have been purchase what the Stalin used, and the Finnish intelligentsia and political class would have been largely exterminated. And this is what Russia started in Ukraine right after the war started. As we know, when they took over towns, Kharkiv area for example, they obviously had lists for people who will be rounded up and who will be killed. In both wars, we see similar change. When Russia attacked Finland and when Russia attacked Ukraine, most of the targets at the early phase of war were military targets. But when the resistance got stronger, Russians started to get frustrated and they started to attack civilian infrastructure. In Winter War it happened just couple of months before the war ended. In Ukraine it started to happen relatively soon, and when the winter 2022-2023 set in, it was obvious that terrorizing the civilian targets, trying to make life impossible, was one of the ways Russians were fighting Ukraine and trying to make Ukrainians to give up. But actually in both cases it seems that the consequences of this indiscriminate cruelty were pretty much the same. They were making the resistance more dedicated. But of course in the case of Ukraine this has been going soon for 2 years when it comes to these massive attacks against civilians, not the war, and the final consequences are not yet known. When it comes to military history, Winter War is interesting, but when you look at the way the war was fought, very little new happened. For Russians, it was a practice run for other operations, and Russians would learn a lot from it, but very little anything new was used there, nothing revolutionary. But when it comes to Ukraine, we are witnessing a new kind of warfare. In some ways it's very old school industrial large-scale warfare between two nations, but on the other hand when we look at the battlefield we are seeing something that has never seen in this way, and mostly it comes to this drone warfare, how unmanned aerial vehicles have changed the war, how they have become so important at every level, from intelligence gathering, for suicide drone attacks, for the attacks against the infrastructure, even individual soldiers, how the drones are now used to direct artillery fire, and so forth. Drones have been existing in the battlefield for a long time, and even armed drones since 1980s, but we have never seen this kind of drone warfare. And it's just not in the air, also on the ground we are seeing these robotic devices being used. Ukrainians have been wreaking havoc to Russian Black Sea Navy with their naval drones and so forth. This is a new kind of warfare. This is also the first war where the large-scale cyber war is part of the war. Of course, we don't actually know how much has been happening in the shadows, so to speak, but this is the first time when developed countries fight also in the cyber sphere, so to speak. So this is something totally different to Winter War. Ukrainian war is really shaping the battlefield of the future, and the whole world is watching what is happening. New technologies are being invented, developed, and existing technologies used in novel ways. Initial similarities were rather strong, but when we look at how those wars developed, we see increasing aspects that are different. We call Winter War 105 Days of Glory, so it was relatively short war, but war in Ukraine has turned into prolonged industrial warfare, which never happened between Russia and Finland. And when both received and Ukraine is receiving support from the international partners, it has changed the war into a proxy war. Finnish war against the Russians was one-on-one war. Ukrainian war was like that at the beginning, but it's now more or less a proxy war. Whether we like this expression or not, that war has become one. And another aspect that separates Winter War from this ongoing war in Ukraine is that in case of Winter War, a political settlement was reached relatively soon. Both sides concluded that the risks of continuation of the war are too high to be taken. Russia was afraid that they are going to get into war with France and United Kingdom, and they wanted to finish the war soon enough. For Finns, the miracle had already happened, and we understood that if we continue fighting the war, we may lose everything. Russians also didn't know how dire our situation was, and the spring was approaching, and it would have meant that the war cannot be continued before the ground again dries up. So Finns were ready for painful compromises, giving lands to the Russians and giving into their demands, and Russians were ready for the compromise in order to prevent the escalation of war. But now in Ukraine, Russia continues this war of conquest, and Ukraine refuses to surrender. They know that it would mean that third phase of war would be threatening them, and their positions would be even weaker and weaker comparing to Russians. Both sides also cannot make any compromise without losing their faces. So now the fight for the survival of Ukrainian nation continues, while the Russians, as they stated again just a few days ago, are trying to conquer Ukraine and finish off the Ukrainian nation. No political solution nor military victory is seen in the horizon now. Then we can look at the international response. There are some things that are similar, some things that are very different. When it comes to Winter War, Finland didn't get much help. Sweden helped us a lot, giving weapons and much of their air force, airplanes for example, and thousands of Swedes came to Finland to fight the Russians. But as a whole, help we got was very limited. But what we were promised was basically an intervention. The French and the British were preparing for this, and also internationally volunteers were showing up. So the pressure was mounting on Russians, and it contributed to the fact that they were ready for the settlement. When it comes to Ukraine, the material help is massive. A lot of material has been delivered to Ukraine, even though far from what one could have hoped for, but absolutely no troops. Of course, there are volunteer forces there, and we know now, thanks to the Germans, that there are undercover troops from Britain at least there, but sending troops to fight Russians is no. for the Western countries, at least for now. So this is a difference. Massive material aid, no troops. Very little aid, but the promises including troops. In 1939, Russia was expelled from the League of Nations, but as a whole, this political isolation and those things, they had very little effect to Russia. And there were no such sanctions regime that we are seeing now, and the Russian economy anyway was quite isolated from the global economy. Now Russia has been targeted by the sanctions. They are working to circumvent them, but the sanctions are hurting Russian economy and costing them quite a lot. But as of today, no economical collapse has been seen. Russia is isolated diplomatically, but unlike in 1939, there are no colonial empires anymore, and a lot of countries in the world, they are either neutral or at least they are not really taking sides, so the isolation is far from perfect. And like it or not, the fact is that the Western powers are not anymore able to yield such power when it comes to the sanctions and things like that. Other countries have become much more independent in their policies, and the war in Ukraine is not of their concern. And actually what is obvious when it comes to anyone who sees the news outside of very limited view is that the way Western countries are arming and supporting Israel in their war in Gaza, it shows how hypocritical Western countries actually are. Okay, it's now time for conclusions. If we look at those two wars, initially they were more similar than later. The way the wars developed are different. The national narratives are very similar when it comes to Ukrainians and Finns. The wars are seen as righteous, just wars that are fought to secure the national survival and the independence of their states. Both wars are imperialistic wars of conquest started by Russians, and in both wars at the initial phases, Russians faced humiliating military defeats. They contributed to the fact that Winter War was concluded politically, and in case of Ukraine, they led into changes of ways of fighting when it comes to Russian military. Russian motives and actions, how they fight, how they explain their war, they are very similar. They are actually nothing new under the sun. And in 2024, Russia is facing an international coalition that didn't happen during the Winter War. This coalition hasn't sent the military forces to Ukraine, but is helping and will be helping Ukraine more and more. Thank you for following this presentation. Please sign up and follow my channel. More of these historical videos about in English are to follow, and thank you.